Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Were the Kids Alright? My name is Sophie, I use she, her pronouns, and for those of you just joining us, this is a podcast where me and my college friend Jacqueline reread and discuss the books we read as kids. But since this is a bonus episode, I'm going to talk about a book I read recently, Cinderella Is Dead by Kalynn Bayron, which I am definitely not pronouncing correctly. Imagine if the fairy tale Cinderella was a country's entire identity. Multiply whatever you come up with by 10, and then add elements of The Handmaid's Tale. So, a fun combo. This is the Kingdom of Lil, and it's pretty bleak. This book takes place a few centuries after Cinderella lived and follows a different character, Sophia, not Cinderella, who experiences Cinderella's story as propaganda for her king's oppressive regime. Sophia and all the other girls in the country are forced to reproduce Cinderella's story at an annual ball, where they must find husbands on penalty of exile or worse. Sophia doesn't want a husband and hopes to run away from the ball with her best friend / secret girlfriend, Erin. But Erin doesn't want to risk her life, not even for Sophia. So Sophia ends up running away without Erin and meets Constance, the descendant of Cinderella's evil stepsister. It turns out that the Cinderella story that Sophia knows is a lie, and that the evil stepfamily was actually working with Cinderella to kill Prince Charming and end his oppressive regime. With help from the original fairy godparent, Amina, Sophia and Constance uncover the disturbing truth behind Cinderella and Prince Charming's happily ever after and work to destroy the regime once and for all. Because this book hasn't been out for very long, I'm going to do both a non-spoiler and a spoiler section of this discussion, and I will let you know the time comes. And then there are going to be a lot of content warnings. So that includes soul-sucking, life-draining, murder, sort of major character death, sexual assault, sexual harassment, state-sanctioned sexism. I would say homophobia, but I wouldn't say that was particular. I'll just go ahead and say homophobia. And then there will also be discussions of racism. So with all that said, let's get into the first section. So Goodreads recommended this book to me, so I ordered it from the library. This is part of a discussion with the episode that's going to be coming out soon, Bud Not Buddy. But Jacqueline and I have been pretty bad about reading authors of color for this podcast. And part of the reason is that the books that we were reading as kids were not reflective of the actual world. And also the publishing industry does a lot of gatekeeping in terms of who gets published and who it props up and advertises. And this was especially a situation before there were more mainstream discussions in the publishing industry, which again is very white, about representation and diversity and what that all means for books. So often the publishing industry says you should be able to see yourself represented in books, which is true, but I also think that it is important for people, especially in positions of privilege like myself, to not just go for the people who we can relate to, because otherwise I would be reading just the same books that we have been reading on this podcast, where there are a lot of white girls solving adventures or something like that. So Goodreads recommended this book to me as part of a Black History Month list, and so I looked at the Goodreads recommendation and decided to read it. I also saw that it was gay, which I thought would be interesting, because I don't think we read books that had canonical queerness despite identities and experiences of the podcast people. So I checked it out. Usually I will read reviews before I read a book just to get a general vibe and see if I actually want to read it. But I saw Cinderella retelling, and then I also saw that it was gay, and I was like, okay, I'm sold. I'll do this. If I was younger, it would have been a very safe book bet for me. Exploring Cinderella from a historical standpoint, so basically some characters looking back on the story, that was really cool. And I haven't seen many books do this investigative component in terms of a fairy tale retelling where, oh yes, this happened in history. Now we're in the future dealing with the aftermath and we got to see what actually happened. So that was cool. And I was very engaged in finding out what actually happened with the Cinderella fairy tale. And also I appreciated that there was a lot of political grounding for a lot of the plot points and a lot of the explanations for the Cinderella fairy tale. So that was very nice for me, as everyone has to hear, like every episode, as a politics major. And it went super hard on exploring sexism, and it was a situation where the world was just so overtly oppressive against women that you would think it wouldn't be that nuanced, because sometimes when you have books where sexism is the big thing, it's so overt and so over the top that it ignores the little nuances that people go through in the day-to-day. Just goes into the cliche where you can tell that people didn't do their research. Well, obviously, this author hasn't needed to do any research. So even though there were parts that did feel a little bit heavy-handed in its messaging about sexism, like there's some commentary about being asked to smile that I just thought was like, oh yeah, this is a little bit over the top, but the writing in general was pretty simplistic in the way that it described things, and so it didn't feel out of line with how the description was being handled in other parts of the books. Descriptions of sexism and all that and the commentary on it did not stand out as embarrassingly overt. So in terms of how I felt about the book, I enjoyed myself while reading this book. I had a good time and I didn't look up spoilers, which is rare for me because usually when there's a mystery, I will immediately read the end. But I was reading the whole way through, I think because there's a lot of dialogue in this book, and dialogue is super easy to read. Even if it doesn't always read as good writing, it's super easy to read. It was fun to see people in the future uncovering the truth instead of simply reliving Cinderella's fairy tale, and I enjoyed the political continuity between both time periods as we find out more about Cinderella's story. And then I also enjoyed the relationship between Sophia and Constance they had pretty good communication. There wasn't much development in terms of their actual relationship. The book felt super short, and I have problems with character development in general with this book, but it didn't annoy me because there wasn't a big drawn-out love triangle with Aaron and Constance, which was refreshing. They communicated their way through that, and I don't know, I blandly rooted for them. I mean, that's all I can really say. The pacing was really quick, which was good. If you do this kind of really intense world and then do it in first-person point of view, it's kind of hard to show the level of depth you need to show if you're doing a first-person point of view where you have to go hard on a character. And because the character development was pretty lacking in this book, the fast pacing made it still engaging and it still made me root for the characters because the story was very tightly wound. But just as we've been talking with Percy Jackson, I did not get a sense of Sophia's emotions beyond surface level reaction. I didn't feel like there was much of a starting point and an ending point with Sophia. And I also didn't feel like she was truly experiencing what was going on around her. There were times when she felt passive, and then there were times that she was just doing things. I wanted a little bit more reflection on what she was doing. Also, there was a lot of dialogue with very little description, which is fun to read because it's kind of like reading a TV show script, which works. And honestly, this would be a very fun little movie. But by little description, I mean little description, because there were opportunities to just say on a base level what something looked like. And Bayron, I think it's Bayron, I cannot tell. Bayron did not really take those opportunities. It was very much, I do this, I say this. So it was a very telly story, which for a fairy tale retelling is usually pretty standard. Yeah, basically nothing was fleshed out. It was a very fun story and it had a lot to say, and I really enjoyed the mystery that it was exploring, but just like a couple more editing passes would have worked well. And then more on the point of view, as I've said a million times before, it is easier to write first-person point of view. It is harder to do it well. And in this book, I understood why there was a first-person point of view. I have been to the author's website, and it seems like she had a very clear voice for Sophia in her head. And I do get that she feels like Sophia had a very clear voice. It reads a little bit to me like the generic first-person present tense YA protagonist, but not quite. There's something a little bit different just because Sophia is generally better at communicating than other YA protagonists, but it did still have that first-person present tense, very generic voice that's in my head. And present tense is very difficult because it can sound very awkward because present tense focuses on the immediacy and the presence. And this is the book that had a lot to do with the past. And I think that that's an interesting thing to explore and look at. But with present tense, what is going on in the present has to be really engaging and really interesting. And it works well for action. And again, we didn't get a lot of description. So it was a lot of I say, I do. And I think it probably would have been better in past tense with the level of description that we had here, just because it would have made more sense as a fairy tale retelling, or not even really a retelling. Yeah. And in terms of dialogue, I thought that the dialogue was pretty consistent. And I was immersed in the story through the dialogue, and I wanted to hear characters' conversations with each other. And that was really what kept me flipping the pages, was the dialogue. I can totally understand why the lack of much else but dialogue would make someone feel like they weren't immersed in the actual story, which is the most common criticism I've seen on Goodreads about this book. Structurally, another thing that I will say is that the actual progression of events felt very standard to a lot of books, so that was good, and I could get a sense of where things were going. But no twist surprised me. I saw every single twist coming, and I also felt like by starting, it didn't ease you into the world, it just put you right in, which I thought was great, but then I also felt like I didn't get a very good sense of the world that we were dealing with, which made it harder for me to fully comprehend the aftermath of what happened with Cinderella. So I really, really, really enjoyed the story. But I would say that if you are looking for good writing and good characters, these are fun characters. And also it's fun if you're looking for a queer book. But I wouldn't say that the writing is especially good. I think that the author is very clearly a good writer. She just needed 2 more editing passes. That's a larger problem that I have seen with the publishing industry, is that if they see that a book is marketable and a book will sell, which obviously this one did because it is a cool concept, then they won't spend as much time editing it, because from a monetary standpoint, if it's going to sell, it's going to sell. So a lot of the hyped books, not the really, really, really hyped books that break outside the YA world, but a lot of the really hyped books need some writing work, just because I bet that people knew that they were going to be popular, so that they didn't edit it as much as they should have. Basically, that is how I felt. I ended up rating it a 3 out of 5 on Goodreads. I would say that I liked it because I did have a good time. I read it in one sitting. I was glued to the page. I usually do not do well with ebooks, but I was just flipping. So that is a mark of a book that engaged me, despite some writing problems I had. So with that, I'm going to now get into some spoilers. So if you don't want to be spoiled, turn off this episode, read the book, come back, or just shut your ears now. So, some characters. I think that it is useful to explain what exactly happened with Cinderella so I can get into some characters. Essentially, what happened was that Cinderella's stepfamily, so they weren't evil. There was this prince who came into power because the fairy godparent, Amina, helped him come into power. But of course, he wasn't popular because he's, not the greatest ruler in the world. He's kind of oppressive. So Cinderella's family, especially her mom, was working to overthrow the prince. So then the prince came to arrest Cinderella's mom, but she resisted. So they killed Cinderella's mom, and then they also killed Cinderella's dad. But that was not before the stepmom came into the picture. And the stepmom is actually really cool and good, and so are the stepsisters. So the fact that they have been painted as evil is actually a function of Cinderella's stepfamily working for the resistance and working against the prince. And Cinderella was also working against the prince. And in fact, she worked with who she thought was on her side, the fairy godmother, to sneak into the ball and get in with the prince so she could kill him. Doesn't work out because fairy godmother is only looking out for the prince, who is her son. She pretends she's remorseful for bringing him to power as an oppressive leader, but no, she is working for the prince all the time, every day, forever, which is a big twist at the end of the book about how Amina was actually bad all along. I'll talk about that later. So Amina basically love potions, or more like mind spells, Cinderella's drink, which forces her to act differently towards the prince. So she does not want to kill him, and she is put under a spell that forces her to love him very briefly. The spell does wear off, but not before they get married and have kids. And so, yeah, Amina is responsible for Cinderella's continual sexual assault. And the spell wears off little by little, so it's not enough for Cinderella to just go and kill him when she can, because once she does start resisting, the prince realizes and starts sucking out her energy. The prince stays young, and he stays alive, and he lives hundreds and hundreds of years until Sophia's time by sucking the life energy out of young girls who come to his palace, usually for a ball. So he does that to Cinderella over time, which is why Cinderella dies at age 38. And the secret of what happened died with her, because now her story story is used as an instrument of oppression from the prince because he needs the girls at the ball so he can suck their life energy and stay in power. He uses Cinderella's story to make people think that their only way to pull themselves out of poverty and make a life for themselves is to do what Cinderella did and find a prince at a ball of some sort. So people are forced to follow this fairy tale and forced to worship it. And it is kind of used as a, this is what you need to be. This is what you need to aspire to be. This is the standard of beauty you should adhere to. And the fairy godmother is upheld as this person who saves Cinderella, and the prince is upheld as this person who saves Cinderella, though people think that the prince is a different prince. It's just the same one, constantly de-aging himself. And so this story is used to keep the prince in power. So he uses it both to oppress women, give him women to suck the life energy out of, and also just generally keep people down, because if he's holding the threat over people all the time about what will happen if you don't adhere to some very stupid, arbitrary, you need to get married at this ball or need to get chosen at this ball, then of course people aren't going to know how to resist, because people are going in and disappearing and people are going in and dying. It's just one of these instruments of oppression disguised as this worship of this lovely story, Cinderella. So, from a world-building perspective, I thought that it was a cool concept that the story of Cinderella was used basically as propaganda and as an instrument of oppression. In fact, the author talked about in a frequently asked questions on her website how she chose the story of Cinderella because it is an accessible story that most people know even without directly reading the fairy tale, so that people would basically know the references. And also because she wanted to pick at some of the more problematic elements of the fairy tale. There are some very problematic elements of the fairy tale. The main thing is at the end of the story. Some people say it's problematic that Cinderella doesn't fight back, but that is problematic in itself to say that Cinderella should have fought back and that she's not a feminist because she didn't fight her evil stepfamily. That is an argument that is regressive and awful and needs to be stopped. And I have seen analysis of how people tend to put down Cinderella's story because, I don't know, people don't understand how abuse works. Whatever. So the part of the story that is really regressive is, of course, that the only way for her to escape her situation is to get married to a prince. And not only that, but get married after one night, and she doesn't always have that much choice in the matter. I think that Ella Enchanted is probably the best retelling of Cinderella that I've seen in terms of fixing some of the problematic elements. And this drew attention to what was problematic about Cinderella. And also I appreciated that it didn't try to paint before the ball as ultra problematic. And in fact, it showed how the portrayal of the stepfamily as evil obscured a lot of the truth. And it was interesting to see a situation where, oh yeah, the stepfamily wasn't evil. They just went against the prince. And so they were demonized forever. But, as I said before, this is a very simple story and there wasn't a lot of description, so the world was not super fleshed out beyond this. And I also thought that the magic system made no sense to me. There was basically no explanation for how magic works at all. And I didn't get a sense of the world beyond Lil. I know it exists, but I don't know what's beyond it. And also, one of the stepsisters, Gabriella, who is the descendant of Constance, or ancestor Constance, they have been working with some people to continue the work of overthrowing the prince for a long time. It seemed like their operation was super small and it wasn't super widely known, and there was basically one hint with some explosion that happened, and it felt like that element and a resistance just wasn't very well fleshed out. I also thought that it was ultra simplistic to have only a mention of one resistance when this is an oppressive regime. So there are going to be more instances of people fighting back quietly or, behind the scenes in other countries. An entire country based around Cinderella is a very cool idea. I do think that in reality, you would have needed a little bit more propaganda beyond just like a very short fairy tale. But it was really cool to show how this was propaganda that was used for the oppression of women. That was an interesting parallel to how these stories have been used in the present day to reinforce gender roles and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and all those lovely, lovely things. I did find it interesting that from what I saw, there were no trans people in this book, which I thought was an oversight, because if you're going to focus on gender, you need to include trans people in that. It's 2021. That's just, I understand if it is 1990 or something like that, but it is 2021. And also, this author already wrote a queer story in this, so she can do it. It's not that hard. You can have your lesbians, but if you are choosing to focus on gender at all, you need to include trans people, because literally that is a question that people are going to be asking about, oh, so what happens when people are trans? Like, what does that mean for their chances at the ball? I don't know. It doesn't seem like there's homophobia in the same way as there is here, because people aren't disgusted on a moral level with people of the same sex or gender getting together. People are opposed to it because it is against the ball and what the king wants, and it is dangerous. It's not like, oh, this is wrong. It's more like, you can't do this because it's dangerous. More people are knowledgeable about the fact that it's not bad on a moral level. Sophia's parents even are not homophobic, and in fact, Sophia's mom actually is very supportive, and Sophia starts the book out. So even in this oppressive world, people know that she is gay, and she knows that she is gay, which I find really cool. It shows how the circumstances of the world don't have to prevent, okay, so the author could have easily just made this a coming out narrative with this whole lesbian slub plot. I mean, it would make sense in terms of the world where there are so many rigid gender roles. But she did not. And I thought that that was really refreshing, and it showed an interesting perspective on being out in a world that wants to put you in a box that's not you, but people know. And there's even a situation where there was a gay man who was going to propose to Sophia so that they could be each other's covers, essentially, so that they could fulfill the thing, but then continue living life as they were. That ultimately doesn't work out because someone puts a claim on Sophia, and then drama goes down, and then Sophia runs away. But I thought that that was interesting, that there was a gay man, Sophia, looking out for each other. The world didn't really hinder this subplot so much. And then in terms of characters, I said before that the characters aren't super developed, but something that I will say about Sophia is that she was pretty generically YA. She was headstrong, she was brave, she was kind, she was a good communicator, which is not typical YA. And the thing that I thought was weird was just how unbothered she is by openly and overtly resisting the king. She has just seen her friend get murdered, or it's not seen, but she has known that her friend has just died. The society is not in her favor, but she's so brazen with her actions at the very beginning. And I was kind of with Aaron, who was just basically like, okay, Sophia, you're being dumb, you're going to get me in so much trouble. Because yeah, Sophia would have gotten Aaron in so much trouble because she was just so overt about her resistance on an almost self-destructive level. That kind of shows Sophia's naivete, and I think that there was a little bit of growth later on about how she was a little bit better at strategizing. I definitely thought that it was kind of funny just how unbothered she was by doing all these honestly really dumb things. But I mean, it paid off for her, so do what you do. Constance was cool. She was also generically brave, good with knives, impressive. I mean, they worked. I thought Erin had the most depth in terms of who she was, because it showed how she was not comfortable going against the regime because she did not want to get in trouble, and she didn't want to get her family in trouble, and yet she still loved Sophia, but she couldn't give Sophia what she wanted and what she needed. And so Erin ended up in a situation where she ended up in an abusive relationship, and I wanted a resolution on that at the end, but I'm not sure we got it, or either that or I didn't read past it. But Erin definitely had the most depth out of all the characters. Something that I have seen about this book is that Amina, the fairy godmother, is praised as being one of the best fairy godmother portrayals of all time. There is so much nuance to the way she was before the twist, where she did the bad things. She's still complicit, but she still feels bad about what she did. And she tried in her own little way to help, but then it didn't work. It was just easier to be complicit. I thought that that was really interesting and shows some lovely parallels with real world and how complicity can work in different structures of privilege, power, and oppression. But then the twist was that she was just evil all along and she never felt bad or anything, which I did not. Or maybe she did feel bad, but she didn't care enough. Sure, it was kind of cool, like, oh yeah, what if Cinderella's godparent was actually really evil? And I mean, you can't come back from putting some drugs in Cinderella's drink to make her fall in love against her will. Or not even fall in love, just make her marry and just like get sexually assaulted. And she did it because she saw that Prince Charming loved her and wanted her. Like, that is so messed up. So there was a lot more nuance before, and she was already going to be evil regardless. You didn't have to make her evil all along. And the way that it was set up, where she was the mother and then was connected to the prince, and so killing her would kill the prince, that wasn't foreshadowed well enough for me to buy it, and it just seemed like a very abrupt decision. And then the prince himself was just so evil. I was fine with that because, again, it was not trying to be a super deep, complex story. It was just trying to do some nice things, say some things about Cinderella, and then, have some fun representation. Yeah, Prince Charming was just evil, and there's not much more I can say about him. There was absolutely nothing redeemable about him. His only motivation was like, oh no, Cinderella didn't love me, whatever. That's it. He wants power, and he wanted Cinderella to love him. He was portrayed very well in terms of his general creepiness, and you got a sense of just how unconcerned he was with consent without overtly spilling the details of what he's done. I actually screamed at one point because of something that he said to a little 10-year-old. It was like, you're going to be very pretty when you're old. That was gross. I would say that the characters they did their job for what they had to do. There could have been more foreshadowing. They could have been fleshed out more, but they did what they had to do. And then in terms of critical analysis, I already went into some things, but I did write some things down because the commentary was interesting, so I will read those out loud. It is important to note for this commentary that the author is a Black woman, so she is writing from that perspective. Okay. I pinched the bridge of my nose and shut my eyes for a second. I know that. My father is a good man. Liv's father is a good man. And even Luke's father seems like a good man. But these good men aren't making the rules. These decent men are turning a blind eye to indecent acts. If you're not one of the men who would jump at the first chance to put a woman in her place, then I'm not talking about you. So that is basically her responding to Luke being like, oh, not all men. And she's just like, oh yeah, not all men doesn't matter because the fact is men have the power. And all men, whether or not they are assholes, are still complicit in the system. So I thought that was really interesting in terms of commentary about how people will be like, oh yeah, not all men, not all white people. I'm not racist. I do this. Maybe it was a little bit obvious in terms of the commentary, but I thought that was a good parallel to real world systems of power. And then here's another one, which kind of shows more about how Cinderella's story and Cinderella's ideal of beauty is pushed on other people, especially, and how that impacts other people, especially people of color, which is what Sophie is. I'm Sophie. Okay, what Sophia is. So Sophia is getting fitted for a dress and getting her hair done, and they're trying to straighten her hair because it fits Cinderella's beauty. And she's just like, we could just leave it the way it is, I say through clenched teeth. They all laugh as if I made a joke. It isn't funny. It feels like a part of me is being changed to fit someone else's vision of what is pretty. I especially don't want to do anything the king prefers. Yeah, so those were just some things that I wanted to highlight in terms of situations that were kind of commentary on real world parallels. Then in terms of gender, again, it bothered me that there weren't any trans people in this book, especially when we're talking about different ideals of what you're supposed to be. There's a lot of you're expected to wear dresses, blah, 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 blah. You're expected to be a certain way. And desirability politics was a huge thing in this book. But for a book that focuses so much on gender, there should be more trans people. Even just some commentary on, I don't know, how people experience gender beyond the binary in this world. And we did get some from Constance, because Constance was talking about how she doesn't want to fit this Cinderella ideal and deliberately goes against the way that people expect her to dress, but that's basically it. I might be missing something because I did read this book really quickly, but I really wish that there were more trans people. And from a sexuality standpoint and from a portraying gay people standpoint, standpoint, I do not know what the author's sexuality is. It's not one of those things where I can be like, oh, I'm reading this, I can tell the author straight. This is not one of those situations. I thought that she did a good job with this portrayal. The romance was very simple and insta-lovey, and it was basically kind of the same deal as all YA, but hey, gay people deserve this standard YA romance situation. So I'm good with that. And you know what? Sophie and Constance were better communicators with each other about their feelings, especially where Aaron was concerned. They were good about checking in with each other about how they felt about Aaron and how that impacted their obvious connection, which they also talked about how they had an obvious connection before they just went for it, which I really appreciated. So that is basically the critical analysis I have for this. There was a lot of intersectionality because there are a lot of books that will focus on gender oppression, but will not go into how other systems of oppression interact. And there was definitely some really good commentary and just portrayal of how things interact with race. If there wasn't explicit racism or there wasn't talk of oppression based off of skin color, there was still some clear beauty standard racism that was happening here. Also, I thought the fact that Luke was a gay man and Sophia was a gay woman, and they were talking about how things are different because even though they are both gay and experience that form of oppression, Luke is a man, and so he doesn't face the same thing that Sophia faces. So I thought that was really important, even though, again, this book was pretty simple in terms of world building and plot and character. It reflected how systems of oppression work in the real world fairly well. Okay. In terms of fanfiction takes, I want an update on Erin. I hope she ditches that man and that man goes to jail. And I hope things will work out. I am concerned that Constance is just kind of taking power without a big movement. The resistance movement is like 2 people. That's not enough momentum to just take power. You can kill the man, but chances are people with the biggest power backing are going to jump in, and Constance and Sophia spent no time building a coalition who can actually take power. So that was just kind of dumb there. But I would go back and make it so that Constance already had a coalition of people beyond just a few, just supporting her behind the scenes. So that when Sophia came in, it was more of a thing. And then it was more of a matter of killing the prince and figuring out what the whole thing was. Because it was already implied that no one knows how to kill the prince because they've tried and tried and tried, but he seems unkillable and nothing ever seems to work no matter how hard they try. And so I thought it would have been realistic to have all these attempts and have this coalition already existing, but then Sophia can still main character and do her thing by actually uncovering how the prince can be killed and then going and doing it. And then I would take away the twist with the fairy godmother. I didn't think it was needed. I thought it would be pretty interesting if they did realize that they needed to kill the fairy godmother to kill the prince, but maybe the fairy godmother didn't know that, or if she did, she didn't want anything to happen, obviously, which could have been why she was hiding out in the woods. I think that it would have been super interesting if they had to make a choice. Well, they would have to actively murder her. It would be something for them to wrestle with, especially because Amina did so many bad things and she has been living for far too long, especially because it's propping up the prince. And so it would have been interesting if they had made the choice instead of continuing this complicity. It makes it way too easy for them to just realize, oh yeah, Amina's evil. Then it's super easy to kill her. Anyway, I still think Amina is evil even without the reveal, but you know, whatever. I also would have set up more magic, because clearly magic exists. I wouldn't just restrict it to 2 people. That's another thing that I would say there. Yeah. Anyway, in terms of my ratings and conclusion, I rated this a 3 out of 5 in terms of star ratings. I liked it enough because I kept reading, and also there was nothing here that was, I don't know, I had a good time. There's some cool parallels to real world systems of oppression. It just wasn't very fleshed out or developed well, but again, that could have been fixed with a few editing passes, and it is a fun, light read, and I would recommend it for people who are just looking for something to do in an afternoon, especially during this pandemic. So with all that said here, in terms of how this fits in my ranking of other Cinderella retellings, there isn't much that comes close to Ella Enchanted in my mind. To be honest, I haven't read an insane amount of Cinderella fairy tale retellings times, but I still read enough to have experienced other ones. I would say that Cinder, I would rank that slightly above this just because Cinder has a little bit more of a fleshed out world, but in terms of the way that the story twists, I'd say it is pretty on par with Cinder. Okay, so that is all for this bonus episode. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram at WTKA_podcast or at our website, link in the description. Thanks for listening. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day, and I will be back with some bonus content, hopefully sometime in the future, as well as Jacqueline. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, and goodbye.